This is SCN's Access and Forward-Looking Charges Significant Code Review SCR webinar. The purpose of today's webinar is to complete an ICE commitment for 2022 to 23. This is ICE commitment 22.01. Which is to host a webinar to inform our stakeholders of the changes and their likely impact following the final decision of Ofgem's significant code review. Today we will present the findings and decisions and talk about what this means to our customers and stakeholders and seeking their feedback as well. We will be hearing from Nigel Besant, who is Head of Network Trading, Daniel Melis, who is the Connections Policy Manager, and Robert Matta, who is the Connections Policy Engineer. We will now hear from Nigel Besant, who is our Head of Networks Trading.
Thank you very much for your time today in joining us as we take you through an overview of the changes which will be coming into effect from the 1st of April 2023, with an opportunity for you to ask questions, but also to help us begin to outline the SCN response and help shape our response through the inputs you give us today. It was back in 2018 that the SCR was launched, and through a fairly comprehensive process, Ofgem have concluded two main areas of change. Firstly, looking at the charging arrangements, they have concluded that they may no longer be providing an effective signal and could potentially even slow down the uptake of low carbon technology. So to remedy this, they propose to reduce the overall connection charge faced by those connecting to the distribution network and to retain and strengthen the existing protections for bill payers. And secondly, Ofgem would like us to look at better definition of access rights for larger users, and in particular to give standardized non-firm access options to be made available for larger users, and to introduce clear curtailment limits and end dates for non-firm arrangements. Now these directions are being taken forward through 4 decuser changes, DCPs 404 and 405 related to access, and DCPs 406 and 407 related to the connection boundary changes. And in parallel, work is being progressed to update the electricity connection charges regulations. Ofgem issued their SCR decision and direction on the 3rd of May, and the 4 decuser change processes started soon afterwards. We expect decuser consultations to be held this summer, so that changes are in place for April next year.
We will now hear from Robert Matta, who is one of our Connections Policy Engineers.
Under the SCR, Ofgem will take the opportunity to review connection boundaries on connection projects. And by connection boundary, what we're referring to is effectively the proportion of job costs that will be expected to be picked up by the connecting customer, as opposed to the proportion of job costs that will be picked up by the DNO and socialised through duos charges. The connection boundary considered for each application will be dependent on whether the site itself is defined as a demand connection or a generation connection. The definition of both a demand and generation connection are still works in progress, which are currently being explored under decuser change DCP 406. But the Ofgem direction is that a demand connection should largely line up with what is defined as a final demand site in accordance with Schedule 32 of the decuser, and a generation connection should largely line up with what is defined as a non-final demand site under the same section of the decuser. Now, I won't get into these definitions too much now, as they may change during the course of the decuser change proposal, but hopefully we should have a clearer direction on this in the coming months. Now, coming back to the application of the connection boundary, what will be defined as a demand connection will ultimately have a shallow connection boundary. And what we mean by that is that these demand connections will not contribute anything towards reinforcement charges associated with their connection unless they trigger a high cost cap, which I'll get into in a moment. And if the connection is defined as a generation connection, then these connections will be classed as a shallow work connection boundary, in that they'll only contribute to reinforcement costs for reinforcement works that take place at the same voltage of the point of connection. Now, I mentioned a moment ago about the high cost cap. So a few of you should be aware that we currently have a generation high cost cap in place with a value of £200 per kilowatt. And the way that this is calculated is that we take the capacity requested as part of the application, multiply that by £200 per kilowatt, and that value presents the maximum value that the DNO will contribute to in regards to the reinforcement costs for that connection, with everything above that high cost cap threshold passed on to the connecting customer. The high cost cap will consider costs associated with the reinforcement at the same voltage and one voltage level above that application in the same way that's currently applied in ED1. So both the value and the process for applying the generation high cost cap is not expected to change under ED2. But what will change under ED2 is that the SCR will introduce this new demand high cost cap with a value set to £1,720 per kVA. And that will be applied in the same way as a generation high cost cap. So for both demand and generation connections, the reinforcement charges should, in most cases, be lower under ED2 than they were in ED1. The SCR decision also notes that there will be no change in the way we define or apply the minimum scheme design. It also states there will be no change to the treatment of applications where the voltage or number of phases are greater than the current network can support. And by that, we're referring to applications where the requested voltage or number of phases exceeds those of the surrounding network, where the surrounding network is capable of providing the capacity requested in an application. In these cases, any reinforcement works will be chargeable in full to the connecting customer as they currently do under ED1. The definition of a speculative development will be updated to provide greater clarity for the connections with planned phases and future expansions. Now, one of the main drivers for this is to hopefully move all DNOs to applying a consistent definition of speculative developments and hopefully eliminate a lot of the inconsistencies that customers may be currently experiencing. The definition itself is still currently under discussion under current DCUSA change DCP 407, so hopefully further details should be available in the coming months. Finally, storage will be treated as generation for connection purposes. This refers to sites that wholly consist of storage connection, such as a battery system. However, treatment of mixed sites is still to be clarified, which again, we should be in better position to communicate in the coming months.
Back to Nigel for a look at the decision and direction for access rights.
The Access SCR introduces new access rights for larger users, both demand and generation. This doesn't include smaller users, such as domestic and non-CT metered customers. Where there isn't sufficient capacity to connect without reinforcement, customers will be given the option to connect on a curtailable basis, whilst additional capacity is made available. And this means at times customers will be asked to turn down or reduce their needs, up to an agreed limit set out in terms of the number of hours or the percentage of time, and up to an explicit end date, after which customers will transfer to non-curtailable access rights. If in operating the network we need to curtail above this limit, we will do so by through flexibility services available on the broader network. But if we needed to exceed the curtailment on this connection, then we would do so by paying an agreed exceeded curtailment price. Industry standard processes will be set out in DCUSA, setting out the process for the curtailment limit, setting the explicit end date, and for setting the exceeded curtailment price. The diagram on the right illustrates that at the time of initial connection, your connection may comprise both curtailable and non-curtailable access rights, which will in time transfer through to non-curtailable access rights.
Back to Rob Matter for a look at the customer impacts.
This slide provides a brief summary of how the SCR is expected to impact different types of customers. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have different user types, and if we start at the top, we have a small solar farm and a large wind farm. So ultimately, we're referring to a typical larger generation connection. The middle column briefly summarizes the impact of the SCR reforms, and in the case of these larger generation customers, the overall connection charge is likely to be reduced in most cases. This is due to the reduction in connection charges for reinforcement works as discussed earlier. In general, the charges for extension assets will not change under ED2, and that's regardless of the connection type. The right-hand column summarizes the access options that will become available under ED2. And again, in regards to these larger generation connections, under ED2, they'll have new connection options such as a curtailable offer with the option of a firm end date. This is to allow for a quicker connection in congested areas. If we move to the second row, the user type we're referred to here is an EV charging station, and in other words, we're referring to a larger demand customer. As above, like the larger generation customer, there's no change to the charges for their extension asset, but again, as we described before in this presentation, the overall connection charge should be reduced as large demand customers will not be expected to contribute towards reinforcement costs in most situations. And like the larger generation customer, large demand customers should qualify for more flexible access options to allow the customer to connect to the network earlier. The third type of user that we discuss in this table is a domestic household customer. The main reason we've distinguished between a smaller and larger demand customer from the row above is that flexible connection options will not be made available to these types of smaller connections. And although a new demand high cost cap has been introduced, this should not affect the smaller demand connection. The final table entry is just a general inclusion to capture connections that do not require any reinforcement works completed prior to connecting. Ultimately, if the connection can be made to the distribution network without the need for reinforcement works, then it will not be impacted by the SCR. And this is simply because, as mentioned earlier, the SCR impacts the treatment of charges associated with the reinforcement works, but not of extension assets.
We will now hear from Daniel Mellis, who is our Connections Policy Manager.
Alongside Ofgem's directions set out in the Access SCR decision, that contains a number of transitional arrangements and clarifications. In-flight jobs to remain under ED1 rules, so projects can be cancelled and reapplied for, but costs already incurred may not be refundable and queue position won't be retained. There are no rebates for customers that connected and contributed to reinforcement costs under ED1 arrangements. Current non-firm customers can apply for a firm connection but may incur some costs. No changes to the current treatment of transmission work triggered by a distribution connection at this time, and any unsuccessful interactive application that reapplies within set timescales should be considered a new application, albeit one that retains its queue position. Since the final decision was published, we've internally started looking at what an indicative customer journey might look like. This is the offer of quotation stage. So a customer would submit their connection application as normal. We would do network studies or system planning studies as required to determine whether there is reinforcement or not. If there is not, then a standard firm connection offer can be developed and issued in line with guaranteed standard requirements. If there is reinforcement required, then we go down two different paths, I suppose. One is that a standard connection offer will be developed, and the future dated standard connection offer will be issued in line with the GS. Customer will also be offered a non-firm connection offer. If the customer agrees to that, we will then develop that offer and issue it alongside the future dated standard connection offer. So if we now move on to the delivery side of the indicative customer journey, if a customer accepts the standard firm connection offer only, then reinforcement works can be completed if applicable, and then the customer may connect at the agreed connection date. If the customer accepts the non-firm connection offer only, the customer will connect on an indefinite non-firm basis. And if the customer accepts both standard and non-firm offers, then the customer will connect on a non-firm basis initially. Reinforcement works will be carried out and completed, and then the customer will be able to transfer to the firm connection offer at the agreed connection date. During non-firm periods, curtailment will be kept below limits using flexibility services as appropriate. If the limit is exceeded, then DNOs will pay an agreed exceeded curtailment price.
We'll now hear from Nigel again regarding wider reforms and next steps.
Access SCR sits amongst a number of wider reforms, including the wholesale market, the introduction of TCR changes to distribution and transmission charges this year and next year, potential reform and review of the DUOS charges starting later this year, and likewise GNIOS reform. This slide sets out the key steps being taken to deliver the new access rights and charging arrangements of the Access SCR. It includes code and regulation changes alongside license changes, and also changes to our systems and training.
Thank you for watching this recording of the SCR webinar. We've got some useful links for you here. And again, thank you for your time.